This week, we speak with John Matherly from Showdown about web app testing, bounty programs, and the journey of security conversations. In the news segment, a misconfiguration leads to SDK sabotage. Browsers adopt more web security standards to defeat XSS camouflage. A marketplace for skills suffers from weak triage, and more. Stay tuned through this advertising montage for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Today, cybercriminals are taking advantage of an expanded attack surface to commit malicious activities ranging from hijacking user accounts to making fraudulent purchases. Businesses need solutions that can protect their sites from this increase in fraudulent activity. Recaptcha Enterprise is a frictionless fraud detection service that leverages our experience from more than a decade of defending the internet with Recaptcha and data for our network of 4 million sites. To learn more about how Recaptcha can defend your website or mobile application against fraudulent activity, visit securityweekly.com/Recaptcha. Security threats in cloud-native environments move fast, which means that security teams need to have the same visibility into their infrastructure, network, and applications as developers and operations. With Datadog security monitoring, engineering teams can easily detect malicious activity in real time before it affects their customers. Use out-of-the-box detection rules and detailed observability data in one unified platform to investigate security attacks. See it in action by signing up for a live security demo and receive a Datadog t-shirt by visiting securityweekly.com/Datadog. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/Synopsys to learn more.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 116, recorded July 27th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Happy Monday before the crazy week known as Black Hat.
Happy Monday before the crazy week. And speaking of things that are crazy, we also have John Kinsella.
Hey, I'm crazy as usual. What else can I say?
You're actually close to Vegas, so you could actually go over there and kind of sit by yourself and virtually watch Black Hat.
You know, hanging out by a pool with a cocktail sounds great, but I'm going to skip that this year.
But we won't be skipping next week, so we'll all be virtual. And, in fact, Security Weekly is an official media partner for Virtual Black Hat 2020. To register and save $200, visit securityweekly.com/summercamp2020 and click the register button. Use discount code 20SecWeekBH. It's on the site, don't worry. Alongside Virtual Black Hat, we'll be running our conference micro interviews virtually in an event called Security Weekly Virtual Hacker Summer Camp from August 3rd through 6th, 2020. Options, pricing, and availability are all listed on the same page. Reserve your slot now to get your message out to Black Hat attendees and talk to crazy John Kinsella. It's a 2-for-1 special. Also, join the Security Weekly mailing list for webcasts and virtual training announcements and to receive your personal invite to our Discord server by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. John Matherly is an internet cartographer, engineer, and founder of Showdown, the world's first search engine for internet-connected devices. He has been at the forefront of Internet of Things for the past 10 years, and his research has been covered on CNN, Bloomberg, Washington Post, and many other outlets. Prior to Showdown, John received a bachelor's degree in bioengineering and worked as a software engineer on bioinformatics applications. Hello, John. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Well, we're happy that you come here to so we can have your research covered on Application Security Weekly, add our name to that list. And one of the things that stood out to me when we had a chat a little bit before this was that you've been participating in conversations for quite a long time. And Internet of Things was mentioned in your bio, and the Internet of Things isn't well known for a great security history. And you've been working in the security community for a long time as well on security websites and interacting with the community. So I'm kind of curious, looking at the community from the perspective of finding vulns, reporting vulns, and having discussions with companies in terms of, hey, I think I found something that you might need to fix. What has that looked like for the past 10 plus years that you've been involved with that?
I mean, when I created Showdown 10 years ago, Internet of Things wasn't a popular term at all. I mean, we described ourselves as a computer search engine, which was really confusing to people because they thought it was like some desktop app. And we first got labeled as an IoT search engine after we got some award. It's like, all right, I guess we're an IoT search engine now. But so before then, I started working with vendors fairly early on. As soon as we started adding some of these industrial control system protocols, because they were easy to say that this should not be on the internet. Right? With some of these IoT products, it was hard to argue why they should be offline, because people are like, well, who cares if my coffee machine is connected and somebody can hack it? Just unplug it, not a big deal. But when we started working with the ICS vendors, it was obvious, this is important, it should be fixed, yada, yada, yada. And 10 years ago, nobody wanted to touch it. Just, you'd notify it. I think a lot of security researchers had very similar experiences where you find a vulnerability, you go to a vendor, and the vendor just says, we're just not interested in fixing this right now. We don't think it's a real problem. Back then, people said nobody would be stupid enough to put it on the internet. Even though we had data, we'd be like, no, these are, real devices. The engineers would be like, no, I don't believe this. This can't be real. And so it took, for ICS, I want to say around 5 years until vendors kind of caught up and were able to start having a conversation about it. And we quickly figured out that the data was the easiest part of the whole conversation. Once we were all on the same page with regards to the data, the tough part was actually getting it fixed. And I don't mean on the vendor side. They can release a patch. That was easy enough. But actually talking to people, that is very, very difficult. What I learned is that the best approach is to try to integrate it into your existing support workflow and not treat it as a separate security issue. These vendors had a lot of concerns about liability, about risk, about notifying their customers that they're running an insecure, setup. They were worried it would blow up in their face. And so instead, what a lot of them end up doing is they would just tell their support staff, hey, whenever somebody talks to you as part of whatever regular maintenance, whatever regular processes you have, ask them if they are doing these things. Are they connecting over the internet? Things like that. And it's a less threatening way of approaching the subject with potentially affected organizations. And so we've tried that. For ICS, this has worked very well, I would say. Also, the stigma of being compromised or attacked is not nearly as bad as it used to be. Now everybody knows that, if you're on the internet, if you're any organization of any size, you're going to get attacked. But nowadays, the challenge is more on the IoT side. And the devices that are everywhere, they're ubiquitous. But people, A, still don't think of them as computers. And B, they don't understand the criticality of having devices deployed at large scale. With ICS, you have a few devices that are critically important. And so it's obvious to say, like, well, if this power plant goes down, that's bad. But if this refrigerator goes down, what, are you going to spoil some food? It's not really as big of a deal to a lot of people until you understand that this is a larger issue. Some of the vendors are understanding. Some of them have been forced to understand. I think D-Link got sued by the FECC, something like that. I think so. And afterwards, they started improving a few things, but I don't see the average consumer in the U.S. at least caring about security, so that makes it a bit more challenging for vendors to justify the cost.
Yeah, that's interesting because a lot of the underlying theme that maybe not even underlying, you're calling it out is working with people and dealing with people and having that conversation. And even that you're saying, it's likely everyone is going to be compromised in some fashion. So that is a good thing to knock down some of the myths about perfect security, to move beyond the real dusty metaphor that you have a hardened castle with a moat outside it protecting you. I'm kind of curious too, is that especially talking with IoT and having those tougher conversations to convince companies, how what are their strategies have been good that have been guided that conversation? Meaning, can you go back and say, well, this is a CVSS 10, therefore just believe me, or this is the branded Heartbleed vulnerability, and therefore that gets some traction. Is there something there that helps that conversation be easier, on top of kind of the data that you'd mentioned?
Yes, so I would say that the CVSS scores have never been a talking point for us. That is like, nobody cares. I will say that the branding kind of works to a large degree. It's kind of gotten diminishing returns recently because everybody's doing it. But when we first started, Heartbleed was, I think, the first one that really had a big marketing push behind it. And, it helped initially. It definitely did. We went down from like 600K affected devices to like 100K, something like that. It was good. Recently, not as much. And instead, what's worked well for us is trying to talk with the people that are in charge of deploying and patching things and talking to them directly. And not doing as much of a marketing and news push. If you followed Showdown, but you might have noticed that a lot of the research, we don't really publicize as much as we used to. And that's because we found that if we just talk directly to the people in a way where they don't need to worry about news coverage or any other thing, if they can just feel like they're in a safe space and just fix the problem, we can notify things afterwards. It's been a friendlier process, and I think the results have been better as well. If you look at, for example, PostgreSQL, they did that approach when they had a remote code execution vulnerability where they didn't say anything. They're like, hey, this is a big thing coming up. Make sure you're patching, but we're not going to disclose any details. And after when they did release the vulnerability information, almost everything had been patched. I mean, it was insane. Like 95+% of devices have been patched at that point, or servers have been patched. Wow. So nowadays, that's the approach we go down a bit more instead of the branded
John,
vulnerability.
Quick, in the early days of we used to use the service as part of some of our research when I was at Tenable, and we, to your point, right, talking to people gets interesting, right? And so you see something like a Heartbleed where it's a named vulnerability. What I've seen the market try to do, and I'm curious on your thoughts on this, right, is to try to create these scorecards, right? Measure what the potential risk looks like. Is that effective in trying to communicate back to an organization that there's a level of risk, or do they not care about what their score is?
That is a very enterprise-oriented solution. And for those organizations, it definitely works. Talking about risk with an enterprise, they love it. Because
so the
that's
scoring
a sort of a metric that they can keep track of. Whereas, typical security products are almost impossible to measure how effective they are. I know there are testing frameworks that you can use to kind of check that they're working, but I remember going to, I think it was I4, one of those KPMG conferences, and the number one issue everybody mentioned was we have too many security applications, too many appliances. We have no idea what is actually working. And having a unified score, they loved it. They absolutely loved it. I don't think that, but that's a very high echelon kind of conversation. What we deal with a lot more is, the engineering departments. And how do we actually get things fixed at that level? And at that level, they don't care as much. It just doesn't, it's not a good metric for them. The only thing that they care about is exposure. How much will it cost them to actually fix and maintain the fixes? And depending on the region, customers care or don't care. In Europe, the consumers are a lot more privacy and security conscious, I would say, than in the US. as having a conversation in Europe is way easier. Also with GDPR, there are all these, data privacy concerns as well that go alongside it. So it's a very different conversation depending on the region.
But if I'm a consumer and I'm out researching different devices, do the manufacturers care if their score, their product scores are lower? Or to your point, maybe the consumer just doesn't care and only enterprises care about reputation or a score where the consumers just maybe don't?
I've never seen a score published for consumer gear. I mean, it'd be interesting to maybe start that as a database. And
I'm sure you could. I think there are websites that will tell you, a rating of an IoT device like webcams. I'm pretty sure somebody's created that, but consumers don't care.
Yeah,
and they're not going to look it up. They definitely don't care about risk score, vulnerability scores. I mean, I could not imagine my parents going into Best Buy, looking at a webcam and being like, "Oh, let me see, are there any CVEs for this?" What?
But
no. What's the resolution? What's the features that actually benefit their lives?
Tie it back a little bit to what you're. I think consumers care a little bit, but I think tie it back a little bit to what we're talking about with the marketing, right? So, they don't care about the security of that webcam, but there's a hell of a lot of people out there, at least in the U.S., which are putting tape over the camera on their TV because they think people want to see them walking around naked, right? So there's some level of care there, but we're probably looking at a completely different risk metric for what that is in a household versus for enterprise.
I am not sure how many people care about that. I say that because the feature set of cameras in the US does not typically include privacy-oriented features. I think the Facebook portal might be one of the few. But if you compare it to European brands of webcams, for example, the Netatmo, comparing it to Nest, those are both, I would say, sort of premium webcam products. The Nest, everything gets streamed, or Dropcam, everything gets streamed through their cloud, right? You can't even connect to it locally, which is very frustrating for me because I want to have some sort of local setup. So there's no way for you to just directly and be in complete control of the data. Everything goes through their servers. Netatmo in Europe is different. They have a dual model where you can either connect directly or over the cloud, opt in. In Europe, enough people cared that they added that. I'm sure Nest could add that to their product if there was enough demand for it. But I don't believe there is.
Yeah, it also sounds like there's the demand also needs to be supported by or countered with what the business model is for managing the camera and where the revenue comes from. So there's a business side of that, but I think also too, John, you're getting to that idea of what's a good secure default, because to a degree, consumers shouldn't have to care about security or privacy, other than is this something have egregious problems, or is this resharing or what's happening to my data associated with this. So maybe that's, instead of the scorecard of how good the security is or how good the privacy is, it's more of this is a good default, and here, by the way, are what some good defaults are, in the sense, kind of like you mentioned, this can actually just be managed locally versus has to be internet connected.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I am all in the camp of the user shouldn't have to know security. I think it's a losing battle if you need to educate the end user about the ever-changing landscape of security. There's going to be a million different scores, a million different ways of looking at it, and I don't think the end user will be able to keep up with that. So instead, just use, as a security industry, we should just encourage vendors to enable defaults that make sense. I think in a lot of other devices, we've kind of gone there. If you look at routers nowadays, when you first install them, there is a setup process. We don't have default passwords as much anymore as we used to. A lot of the IoT products just aren't there yet, but they're getting there. I think they're getting there slowly.
Yeah, and I think the UK, John, I think the UK just laid out some guidelines for IoT devices, for consumer devices, right? You can't have a default password. It can't be reset to a global default. Has to be supported for a period of time with some updates. I mean, so the UK is trying to do some things here to create at least 3 to 5 kind of default configurations for IoT devices. Are you seeing that traction anywhere else?
I mean, not in the US. I think there are some efforts. What is it? There's the testing lab. I forget what it's called in the US that is trying to establish a standard. Because Europe, they have lots of standards. They have like TÜV standards. They have a lot of, most devices need to follow some sort of standard. So in Europe, it's par for the course. And it makes sense to have that for these IoT products. And I think it's interesting that they also have sort of guaranteed maintenance windows. Because the other aspect of IoT that we're seeing is the idea of planned obsolescence, which is just kind of mind-boggling, especially for IoT products. The idea of that vendors would design it so it only lasts for 1 to 2 years on purpose. With expected failure rates that, you need to replace it soon. I think Europe is probably at the forefront. Asia, I don't see much of that. US, limited. US, people are very cautious. I think, to a degree, rightfully so, to ask for government intervention by establishing a standard. But I think for these kind of areas, that approach makes sense. And what you described in the UK sounds like really bare bones. Everybody should be happy. We shouldn't be arguing about those things. So I would love to see that in the US.
Yeah, I think I think it's Underwriters Laboratory is what you're referring to.
Yes,
They've
thank
talked
you.
about
Yes.
different ways of doing that. And also Mudge, I can't remember the exact website for it. So someone who's hanging out in the Discord, please look it up. But Mudge was putting together sort of a cybersecurity index for different, for browsers, operating systems, phone operating systems like Android, iOS, that was basically evaluating here are the secure defaults or the secure behaviors that have been enforced here. And that may be anything from what the compiler settings are for it, those types of protections and hardening, to some of what Matt was just mentioning that's coming out of the UK around not resetting back to a global password, things like that. So I know there are some disconnected, perhaps, efforts there, but clearly, if I'm struggling to remember what it is, it's not quite pervasive and it hasn't had a significant impact on the consumer market. So that's definitely an area where there's a lot of work to be done still.
Yeah, we're still early, really early in the space, in my mind. We haven't really solidified all the platforms that'll be around long term. So, and I do sense that people are slowly getting on board the same way they are with ICS. It's taking a bit of time. Again, there aren't a lot of incentives early on in sort of the IoT or tech cycle to spend money on security.
So what's kind of interesting too is that you did mention that 10 years ago and diving into ICS and just talking with the engineers, having really fruitful conversations with them. With IoT devices, there have been a good handful, maybe 2 handfuls of articles on especially cameras, on nanny cams, things like that. And a lot of researchers and basically bug bounty researchers have found and published vulnerabilities. One of the things though, and maybe to your point here, is maybe we still are in early days, despite how long IoT has been around, because sometimes those bug bounty reports can be quite on the nose and saying, here's an absolute risk, this should be addressed. Other times they may be overblown or the risk might be overly hyped. So maybe when you see that from the sort of that bug bounty and consumer IoT space, what have you seen ways of, or do you have suggestions on how to make that conversation a bit healthier and focus that bug bounty so it can grow into the conversations you've been having with ICS now?
Bug bounties are an interesting topic for me because I am not a fan. I am not a fan at all of modern day bug bounties, just because they generate so much noise. It's insane. I think if you run any public project, you're going to get so many, bug bounty researchers contacting you about just nonsense 24/7. And so you end up having this stack of useless reports, but you have to read all of them just for that, chance that there is something really important that you have to look at. But I do believe a more targeted approach is better. And we also need to keep in mind that a lot of these organizations, they don't maybe have a huge security team either. Even though they might have a lot of engineers, they might have a lot of security people to manage incoming reports. So, pick and choose, but I think that we're really bad about it in security. Whatever you work on, if you're in security, you feel like it's the most important thing ever, and everybody needs to pay attention to it. And it turns out it can be a bit overwhelming on the receiving end. We have some experience with that nowadays. So I don't see bug bounties as really being a solution at all for this space. It's just...
No, it's interesting because I did like what you were saying early on about just handling security intake, not necessarily triage, through your normal customer support program. And here again, I think we're very focused on with a emphasis on sort of the consumer space and perhaps IoT devices. And of course, there are the options to pay someone else, to handle that, to manage that noise and noise versus signal of bounty programs. But so, I think you're...
It is different, though, for the consumer space, because in ICS, their customers are paying them hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for their hardware. And so they have a constant dialogue with the vendor anyways. That's very common. You're paying so much money and you have a lot of technical questions, so you reach out. That's not the case for a lot of consumer electronics. You don't, if you have a problem with your webcam, you go online, you check out, some forums. You don't get on a phone, typically, with a tech at, the webcam company. And even if you do, you're going to have to go through many different layers of support until you get somebody technical enough where they can even have a conversation about security. So that's why for these consumer level electronics, we are much more focused about working with the engineering department and the vendors. It's less the human aspect. Well, if anything, it's trying to add more mechanisms to remove the human aspect, remove the requirement that people even need to be aware of these things. Whether that means, automatically checking if you're on the internet in some sort of background job. There's a lot of things you can do to kind of try to protect the end user from themselves, but it's not quite the same as for industrial control systems.
John, you bring up, we're going to cover this in an article in the next segment, right? And one of the challenges, I think, with engineering teams is giving them enough information that they know how to solve the potential issue. How are you helping these engineering teams not only identify the issue, but help them resolve the issue? Because if they don't have the skill set, because they don't have a big security team, as we've talked about, how do you give them enough information so the engineering team knows how to fix the problem?
I mean, with the engineering teams, from our perspective, it's a lot of education about how the internet works. It can sound a bit silly, but if you don't spend a lot of time, on networking, you don't really know a lot of the details or enough of the details to know how to be safe in working on a network. Even just, ports, network scanning, discovery. There are a lot of fundamentals that engineers don't learn or don't, keep up with. And so it's actually not that difficult to kind of get them on the same page as, so they understand at least what the problem is. And fixing is easy. Really, at least the stuff that we're looking at is very simple and straightforward. It's kind of a binary thing. Is there misconfiguration going on? Yes, no. For example, I wrote an article a few years ago about Roku devices. How you can find out what a person is using or has installed on Roku. And so I scanned the internet and I created this, app store ranking based on the information I was creating from Roku. And so, we also reached out to Roku and their director. I met up with him at DEF CON. He was a cool guy. And I just explained to them how we did it. Hey, you're listening on 000 instead of, just localhost or some other thing. And he was like, oh, I didn't realize. Okay. And then it was fixed like a week later in a patch. They just, it was something very fundamental. They missed it. They weren't paying attention. They didn't realize that there was a difference. Actually, one of the other things that we very often see with IoT products is that they don't separate debug or development builds from production builds, or they're not good about flagging them properly, so they disable some debug settings. So that's the other aspect where we try to improve, but it's not difficult. What we look at is not the same as what a typical vulnerability researcher looks at, where it's race conditions and a lot more complicated stuff. We're much more on the, hey, this is very basic. Here's what you can do.
But that's what was sort of, and still is fairly, I'll say impressive, if not amazing, about Showdown, right? Is any of us could go in, and map and gather at least some of this information, but it talks cheap, and being able to put it there and making it easy both for folks to be able to query it and then also making a business out of it. I think that's what's sort of the interesting part here, and that there's such voluminous amount of these type of examples that you're talking about, that each one by itself is individually easy to fix. And we're Application Security Weekly, so we hope that people have some level of experience in this or understanding, but hopefully we're able to use this to shine a little bit more light on it and get people to think more about this.
Yeah, the other thing I would mention is that I feel like as a security industry, we are surprisingly bad at fixing the basics, or making sure the basics remain fixed. We know these are problems. We know how to fix them, but we've not been amazing at communicating how to fix it. And I feel like we haven't spent enough time figuring out the processes to actually talk to other vendors and talk to companies, and actually just because Showdown finds, for the most part, low-hanging fruit. It's not rocket science. It's really straightforward, but it remains a problem 10 years later, right? I remember I gave a talk once to sort of a non-technical audience, and the first question I got was like, "Oh, well, what's Showdown going to do when everything's fixed?" And I'm like, what? I mean, who are you? What is this? It makes no sense.
Where have you been the last 20 plus years?
Yeah, I'm like, okay, clearly you don't work in security. A lot of these things, it's just we really, from my perspective, I'm just trying to focus on the basics. I'm not trying to get clever. I'm not trying to get fancy. I'm just trying to, slowly make improvements to the security of some of these products, and hopefully over time it'll pay off.
No, it's definitely fighting the good fight. And the only complaint I have is that, unfortunately, that approach just doesn't scale, because we can only send you to so many DEF CONs for so many conversations, which are a fantastic way of building that rapport and just getting things fixed, because that's ultimately what happens, but what needs to happen. But I guess it's going to take a lot more of you before Showdown actually will go away, and you'll have to reinvent some other new IoT type of service.
Not everything has to scale. I just think we should be okay with that. Not everything has to scale. I do believe that if we get to a critical threshold of enough vendors being on the same page, then that's fine. That's good enough. I'm not worried. I'm not going to follow up with some of these really cheap, Chinese knockoff vendors. Like, good luck, right? I mean, that's just, they keep being pushed out, and I can't follow up with that. But I'm okay having certain things that don't scale with technology, and I don't think there's any other way to do it properly. But if there is, I'd love to be proven wrong.
Well, we definitely didn't come here to have you proven wrong. We actually wanted to hear what you had to say about IoT, ICS, and I think you left us with some good messages about the looking ahead for even the next 10 years, about the security community, security researchers, just having those really helpful, productive conversation with the engineering teams to say, here's a problem, here's perhaps how to fix it, or here's why it needs to be fixed. Let's go forward and do that. So, John, I want to thank you for coming on and having this conversation with us.
Thank you for having me.
Also want to thank Matt and John for once again joining us. I want to thank everyone else for listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.